I knew something was wrong the second I saw the brand. It was a clean morning, the kind where the sky looks too blue, the air smells too fresh, and the world feels too quiet. Like it's holding its breath before something goes wrong. And sure, enough. Something had. My cattle were marked, every last one of them. A fresh, ugly brand burned into their hides right beside my own, like a stain I couldn't scrub away. It was a logo, a twisted, ridiculous insignia of a homeowners association. Not just any HOA. Her HOA, Patricia Denning. 56, platinum blonde, fond of pastel cardigans and wielding power like a hammer. The self-appointed queen of the Wellington Oaks Homeowners Association, and the undisputed terror of every poor bastard who lived under its rule. And now, apparently, the woman who thought she had authority over my cattle. I crouched beside the nearest steer, brushing my fingers over the raw, swollen flesh. The burn was fresh, hours old at best. That meant someone had come onto my property, corralled my cattle, and branded them in the dead of night. I knew exactly who had given the order, and if Patricia Denning thought she could pull this off, she had no idea who she was messing with. It started small. It always does. First, it was a letter, folded neatly, slid under the gate to my ranch. Dear Mr. Callahan, as a new member of the Wellington Oaks Homeowners Association, you are required to abide by our aesthetic and regulatory guidelines to maintain the integrity of our community. Your cattle, while charming, currently violate our uniformity standards. We expect full compliance. I had chuckled at the absurdity of it. Cattle violating uniformity standards, as if they were flower beds or mailboxes. I ignored it. Then came the fines, $200. Failure to ensure livestock meet neighborhood standards, $500. Unauthorized animal activity within a residential zone, $1,000. Continued non-compliance. Each notice was more ridiculous than the last, printed on thick, overpriced stationery, signed with Patricia's loopy, self-important scrawl. I burned them one by one. Then the real harassment started. A neighbor, Henry Barlow, pulled me aside at the feed store. You know she's been talking about you, right? I gave him a look. She talks about everybody. Yeah, but this time, she's got the board involved. Says you're a nuisance, a threat to the peaceful suburban atmosphere. Because of my cattle. She's saying they stink. Says they make too much noise. Says they, He rubbed the back of his neck. She told a few folks they lower property values. That got me. Property values. That was Patricia's real gospel. The whole HOA was built on the idea that appearances were everything. Picket fences, uniform lawns, every house painted in one of 3 approved shades of beige. And then there was me. I was not beige. I was the rancher who had inherited his family land generations before Wellington Oaks ever existed. The one who refused to sell to developers when they paved over the prairie and planted McMansions where good grazing land used to be. The one Patricia couldn't control. Until now, apparently. I was still trying to figure out her angle when I found the brand. And that's when it hit me. She'd been waiting for me to fight her on this, because the second I did, I'd be acknowledging her power, giving her the chance to drag me into some bureaucratic nightmare of fines and legal fees. But this wasn't a fine. This was criminal. I knew because it was my job to enforce it. Patricia Denning had just committed felony livestock tampering, and I was the goddamn livestock commissioner for the state of Texas. I found her at the HOA's monthly meeting, holding court in the neighborhood clubhouse like she was some kind of suburban monarch. She barely flinched when I stepped inside, just smoothed down her cardigan and offered me that smug, tight-lipped smile she saved for rule breakers. Mr. Callahan, she said sweetly, as if she hadn't just branded my cattle like they were her property. How nice of you to finally join us. I didn't sit. We need to talk. Her eyebrows lifted. Oh? I tossed a photo onto the table, a close-up of the fresh, still-healing brand on one of my steers. The logo of her HOA burned deep into its hide. The room went silent. Patricia picked up the photo delicately, studying it with a little tilt of her head. Oh dear, she murmured. It looks like someone took initiative. Someone committed a felony, I corrected. Under Texas law, tampering with livestock, especially branding without the owner's consent, is a criminal offense. Carries a hefty fine. Prison time, too. She actually had the nerve to laugh. A light, dismissive sound like I had just told her she'd overbaked a casserole. Oh, come now. Let's not be dramatic. I simply made sure your cattle met our HOA standards. They belong to a neighborhood now, don't they? I took a step closer, lowering my voice just enough. They belong to me. And last I checked, an HOA can't rebrand private property. Your property, she said with a little shrug, exists within Wellington Oaks. That means it's subject to Wellington Oaks guidelines. And I believe you'll find that, as HOA president, I have the authority to enforce compliance. She was so confident, so sure of herself, she thought she was untouchable. I stared at her, my mind already working. She had just admitted, out loud, that she'd ordered my cattle rebranded, in front of the entire HOA board. She had no idea what she'd just done. Patricia Denning had finally overplayed her hand. I just needed to make my next move count. I held her gaze, letting the silence stretch. The whole room was watching, bored. Members, neighborhood busybodies, even a few people who had come just for the free coffee and gossip. Patricia didn't look concerned. If anything, she looked pleased. She thought she had me. Well, she said, setting the photo down like it was a piece of junk mail, I'd hate to see this little misunderstanding turn into a fuss. A fuss. I clenched my jaw. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's a felony, she smiled. That sounds like such a harsh word. She had no idea, did she? None at all. I could have called the sheriff right then. Could have walked out and made one phone call, and she'd be dealing with law enforcement instead of a homeowners association meeting. But no, that was too easy. Patricia wasn't just some overzealous HOA president. She was a dictator in a twin set, a woman who had spent years weaving her web of power over this community, tightening her grip inch by inch until people stopped, fighting back. People feared her. That was what needed to be broken. So I smiled back. Slow, easy. I'll tell you what, Patricia, I said. Let's not rush into anything. You're right. It'd be a shame to turn this into a whole ordeal. Why don't we take a moment to discuss the situation? Just the two of us. Her expression flickered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered fast. That sounds reasonable. Reasonable. She thought she was negotiating. I met her at her house the next day. A pristine 2-story with a white picket fence, a symmetrical garden, and an American flag hanging just so by the front door. It was exactly what she wanted the whole neighborhood to look like. She answered the door with the same saccharine smile she always wore when she was about to twist the knife. I hope you're coming with a solution, she said, stepping aside, to let me in. I'd hate to see this get ugly. It was already ugly, but I played along. I walked inside, noting the perfectly staged furniture, the absence of anything personal. Not a single framed photo, no clutter. Just the sterile perfection of someone who cared more about appearances than real life. Patricia gestured to a seat, but I didn't take it. You ever been to a livestock auction? I asked, her brows knitted. Excuse me? See, branding is a big deal in my line of work. It's proof of ownership. Every brand is registered with the state. When you mess with a brand, you're not just vandalizing property, you're stealing. And theft of livestock, that carries a prison sentence. Her smile didn't falter, but I saw the flicker of something in her eyes. Now, I continued, I could go straight to the authorities. But like you said, no need to make this a fuss. You and I could come to an understanding instead. There it was, the thing she wanted most. Control. She thought I was handing it to her. Patricia folded her hands primly. And what kind of understanding would that be? I leaned against the doorframe, casual. You undo what you did, publicly. Admit you overstepped and we put this behind us. Her eyes went cold. You expect me to, what? Apologize? That's the idea. She let out, a sharp little laugh shaking her head. Oh, Mr. Callahan, I think you're overestimating your position here. I tilted my head. Am I? Her smile sharpened. You see, I knew you'd come here trying to strong-arm me. That's why I took some precautions. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder. Thick, stuffed full of papers. I didn't like that. She placed it on the table and slid it toward me. This, she said sweetly, is every complaint ever filed against your property. Every noise violation. Every zoning technicality. Every regulation you've ignored. I flipped through the pages. Half of it was nonsense, trumped up infractions, petty citations, but some of it was real. Patricia leaned in, lowering her voice. You think I don't know who you are? You're an obstacle. One that should have been gone years. Ego. But I'm a patient woman, and I knew if I waited long enough, you'd give me the perfect excuse. I set the folder down, keeping my face unreadable. Patricia smiled wider. You threaten me with the law. Well, I have the law too. You have weeks, Mr. Callahan. Maybe days if I push it. When I'm done, that ranch of yours will be condemned for non-compliance. And you'll be the one who's gone. She thought she had me cornered. She thought she had already won. I forced a slow nod. I see, Patricia leaned back, triumphant. Then I trust we won't be having this conversation again. No, I said, we won't. Because now I knew exactly how I was going to take her down. I didn't waste time. I spent the next few days doing my kind of research, digging, watching, making calls. Patricia had built herself an empire, but empires have cracks. And then I found it, the weak spot, the thing she never thought anyone would see. I went back to the Wellington Oaks clubhouse the next week, just in time for the next board meeting. Patricia was already there, perched at the head of the table, wearing that same smug look. She barely glanced at me as I walked in. Mr. Callahan, she said smoothly, you're not on the agenda. I smiled. Guess I should have called ahead. I dropped a folder onto the table. Patricia frowned. What's this? I leaned in, lowering my voice just enough. Oh, just some interesting paperwork I came across. She hesitated, then flipped it open. Her face changed. I saw the moment she realized what I had found. The blood drained from her face. Her breath caught. She looked up, and for the first time, she looked afraid. I grinned. Now, Patricia, I said softly, let's talk about your compliance. Patricia's fingers tightened around the edges of the folder. For a moment, she didn't speak, just flipped through the pages inside. Her expression locked in forced neutrality. But I saw it, the flicker of panic, the tightening around her mouth. She knew what she was looking at. I'm not sure I understand, she said, voice light, like she still had the upper hand. Oh, I think you do, I said, stepping forward. See, I had a little time on my hands after our last chat. Thought I'd do some digging. And what do you know? Turns out you haven't been playing by your own rules. I tapped the folder. This is a full audit of Wellington Oaks' HOA finances. I let that settle. Seems you've been collecting a whole lot of extra fees over the years. Some legal, some... well, not so much. Her jaw tensed. I kept going. $50 neighborhood beautification fees that never went toward any beautification. Unjustified HOA violations levied against specific homeowners, ones who just so happened to oppose. Hell, even some fines for unauthorized landscaping, when someone planted flowers that weren't on your approved list. I flipped a page and slid it toward her. And then there's the big one, the special preservation tax you imposed on homeowners. You remember that one, don't you? The one that was supposed to go toward historic conservation? I leaned in. Funny thing, there's no record of that money ever making it to the city. Patricia's face was pale now. The board members around her were shifting uncomfortably, glancing at each other. I turned to the room. Did any of you know about this? Silence. A few heads shook. Others just stared at Patricia, waiting for her to explain. She cleared her throat, forcing a smile. Mr. Callahan, these are outrageous accusations. I have always acted in the best interest of this community. I laughed. You branded my cattle with an HOA logo, Patricia. You really want to talk about best interests? A murmur rippled through the room. Someone whispered, She did what? Patricia straightened. This is ridiculous. You are the one in violation here. This is a private meeting, and I cut her off, my voice dropping just enough for the whole room to feel the shift. Oh, Patricia, you still don't get it, do you? I smiled, slow and deliberate. I'm not just some rancher with a problem. I'm the state livestock commissioner. I enforce agricultural law. And what you did? That wasn't just a petty HOA infraction. I let that sink in. You committed felony livestock tampering, someone gasped. A board member whispered, That's a serious charge. Patricia's eyes darted to the faces around her, her confidence starting to crack. I leaned closer. You branded my cattle. You stole them in the eyes of the law. And when you did that, you gave me the legal power to investigate every single part of this HOA. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. So here's what's going to happen, I continued, taking my time. You're going to step down immediately. You're going to sign a full resignation from the Wellington Oaks HOA, effective today. No appeals. No negotiations. I held up another paper and tossed it onto the table. And you're going to sign this public statement admitting to your financial misconduct. Patricia laughed. A short, brittle thing. You think I'd sign that? I smiled. You will, because if you don't, I tapped my phone. I have 3 different agencies who would love to take a look at this. State fraud investigators, the county sheriff's office, and I let my smile widen, just for effect. The IRS, you've been skimming off the top for years. You really think your taxes are clean? She froze. That was it. The kill shot. For the first time in her life, Patricia Denning had no words. A long, thick silence stretched through the room. The board members were watching her now, not as followers, not as enforcers of her petty rules, but as people finally seeing her for what she was. Powerless. And just like that, Patricia's world started to crumble. I saw it in real time. The board. Members who once stood behind her suddenly weren't so loyal. Someone muttered, She can't just do that. Another person asked, Wait, where is all that money? The questions started piling up, and Patricia couldn't keep up. I stepped back, watching as the tide turned. Her power had never been real. Not really. It had only ever existed because people let it. And now? Now they weren't afraid anymore. The resignation came that night. A formal public statement. The HOA board dissolved the fines, reversed the regulations she had pushed, and opened a full financial audit. By morning, Patricia's house had a for sale sign staked in the front yard. Heard she left town before the investigations could catch up to her. Probably thought if she ran fast enough, she could outrun the fallout. But there are some things you can't run from. A week later, I stood at the fence line of my property, watching my cattle graze, unbranded by anything but my own mark. Henry, Barlow pulled up in his truck, stepping out with a grin. Heard the HOA is officially rewriting the rule book, he said. No more petty fines. No more threats. Hell, they're even talking about getting rid of the HOA altogether. I smiled. Imagine that. He leaned on the fence, shaking his head. Never thought I'd see the day. That woman was like a damn dictator. Thought she was untouchable. I shrugged. Turns out she wasn't. Henry chuckled. You ever wonder why she went after you so hard? Like, why specifically you? I thought about it. Thought about Patricia. About the control she craved. The power she wielded like a club. Over everyone around her. She didn't hate my cattle, I said finally. She hated the fact that she couldn't control me. Henry let out a low whistle. Well, she sure learned the hard way. I watched the sun sink low over my land. Mine, free from her rules, her threats, her grip. Yeah, she sure did.